or so. And yet the positions out. So where do we go from here? The IMF has, as we know, in the last few days, downgraded the growth outlook. The ECB is in the process of embarking on a trillion-euro expansion of the balance sheet if it can find enough paper to buy. We have negative interest rates in Europe, and still the patient's vital signs are weakening. What needs to change? What do we need to do differently from what's been tried over the last 6 years or so? This is what I want our panelists to focus on. Minister Padoan, if I can start with you on just where we get the growth from. Prime Minister Renzi took power with a message of reform. When do we see evidence that that reform is starting to gain traction? If you look at the numbers, we have negative 0.2% growth for the second quarter in Italy. We've seen unemployment at over 12%, youth unemployment at over 44%. Government spending has increased in the last 8 months of Mr. Renzi's power. When does the restructuring and the reform begin to bear fruit in Italy?
Well, thanks first of all for having me here. Let me just start by saying something about Europe in general. And Europe, of course, does need very strongly to focus on growth and jobs after having concentrated, rightfully so, on fiscal consolidation first and on banking union and financial sector repair. Now it's time to add to the agenda the growth part. And the growth part is difficult to tackle with, including in understanding what's missing. I would say, even at the risk of failed economics 101, that we are in a situation where we lack both supply and demand. So we need to work on all sides of the equation. How do we do that? Well, in a number of ways, which are in some cases country-specific. Certainly, structural reforms play a large role. Let me come quickly to Italy, since you are asking about my country. Italy is facing a twin challenge. It's facing a challenge which dates back at least 2 decades ago, when we started accumulating obstacles to growth at the structural level and where we are beginning to see decline in productivity. So we need to tackle old problems. The second challenge is that we have to do that in a recession. This is going to be, unfortunately, a 3rd year in a row of recession in the country. So how do we reconcile that with the need to kick off growth? Well, we need to do that with a strategy which goes beyond the short term. And I think this is true for my country, but it's also true for Europe. Why is that? Well, because if we need structural reforms, which we do, we need to understand that structural reforms take time to bear fruits and therefore coagulate political and social consensus. We need to kickstart them. We need to vote them. We need to implement them. And
with the greatest of respect, we've had 6 years. The gentleman next to you this morning has said the situation in Europe will change when France and Italy implement structural reforms. Finance Minister Schäuble, we don't have the patience, we don't have the time or the patience to wait, do we, for these reforms to take place? We need growth now.
You ask me?
Yes. I'm asking you actually to respond to Minister Padoan, because he's saying, give us time. We'll get round to it. We'll do the reforms.
I do not disagree with Piercarlo. You will not see that we Europeans will dispute in this framework, because Europe is complex, and of course we need structural reforms. We agree on this, and we have different problems in any member state, and therefore we have to work together. We know we have a common responsibility in relation to a global economy. That's what we are here in the IMF framework and in the G20 we are delivering. We are delivering in the G20 as well. We agreed again and again that we have to stick on this way, and we have to do both. Having said this, we have been rather successful in overcoming the euro crisis, which had been the reason of the euro crisis, at the very beginning of the euro crisis, has not been in the eurozone. To be very frank, this has been the financial crisis, the banking crisis has started in the United States. And then we, as a result of the banking crisis, we got the euro crisis. And we had to overcome the lack of confidence whether this European monetary union, with a common currency by 18 different member states, 18 different national fiscal and economic policies, could be successful or not. We had overcome these doubts in a more successful than everybody expected. And now we have to work for more growth, and we are doing, and we will deliver, by the way. We Europeans will deliver, you can trust on this. But I will not, what we have to discuss between Italian government and German government, we will not do it in this podium.
Well, what I'd like to achieve is perhaps some realism in the conversation, because are you suggesting that there is no difference of opinion on how we ultimately get to the goal that we're all seeking, which is a renewal for Europe and a growth agenda for Europe that actually succeeds? Look, we interviewed Mr. Marchioni, the head of Fiat, when we were at the Italian summit recently, and I quote his words: "In these past few years, I have seen little or no change in this country." That was September the 7th. Those are his comments about Italy. You want to see reform in Italy. Mr. Padoan, why doesn't Sergio Marchioni see reform in Italy?
Well, I don't know. I don't wear his glasses, but let me just remember that today, Italian time, the Senate just passed the Jobs Act, which I think it's a major achievement. It's not over yet. We still have to go to the lower house, but this is a major political achievement. This is one part. Then we will have to implement and see whether results match expectations. But I am confident that we are pushing through a very ambitious reform agenda. It's not just a labor market, it's others as well.
Peter Pratt, can I just, sorry to overrule you, Minister, but Peter Pratt, he's an ECB board member. He said, in Italy, it's a problem of implementation. The legislation's being put in place, but the implementation is lacking.
Peter Pratt, a good friend of mine, is absolutely right. So we are to be tested on implementation as well. We will be.
Mr. Schäuble, sorry I cut across you. Please come in.
Now, we had a meeting of, by the way, Riccardo Padoan is the president of the European finance ministers in this half year. And under Italian presidency, we agreed some weeks ago in Milano on a meeting on the way to get more growth, sustainable growth in Europe. And we all agreed that we have to stick for more investment, for more innovation, for more research, for more infrastructural reforms, for improving institutional framework wherever needed. And I can tell you, it's not a matter of bashing one or the other member state. Every member state has to take care, even Germany has to take care that we move towards more investment in our budget figures. We are working on this. We know we have our own problems. We never do bashing each other. That is not the way Europe works.
But can I ask you, would you agree to a change in the fiscal rules in Europe that allowed a little more flexibility on member states that are showing good efforts on restructuring? Is there some wiggle room, perhaps, in the German position that might allow some of these budget deficits to remain at 3% plus, whilst countries that are engaging in the hard work are doing their job?
Look, we have enough flexibility in the European rules. Nobody is asking, no one is asking, nor the French government, nor the Italian government is asking for any change of the European rules. There's enough flexibility. It's a matter of implementation, as Pierre Carlos just agreed. The problem is implementation. The problem is in the given European structure, the higher relevance of the moral hazard problematic, and in this way we have to solve our European problems. But and therefore we have enough enough structures. There will be no of implementation, and now they want to improve, together with our colleagues which are responsible for labor markets.
Minister Padoan, I don't think anybody's saying that this process is easy. I mean, clearly it isn't, and clearly we see politicians and governments struggling currently with the political narrative in Europe. It is not a good time, as we see growth generally weakening, to try and impose fiscal austerity. I wonder if you could just share with us maybe some examples from the Italian experience that you have, where you have overcome some of the challenges, or you have perhaps got workers' councils or unions to accept there need to be adjustments for the sake of growth.
Let me quote two examples. One, which has been already achieved, that's about the pension system. The pension system in my country used to be under heavy criticism, and rightly so. Now it has become one of the more sustainable over the long term. And this is achievement of past governments. And as far as the current government is concerned, as I said, we have a very ambitious, someone would say too ambitious reform agenda. But let me again just quote the labor market reform, which will introduce a dramatic change in increasing flexibility in hiring and also laying off workers, and especially opening up the gate of the labor market to the young people, so increasing the incentives for firms to hire young people, which is essential. In the past, much attention has been devoted to protecting so-called insiders and very little attention to so-called outsiders, to use a jargon term. Now this is over. It's going to be simpler, more linked to productivity, and in the end we will have more jobs and more remuneration for jobs.
And Minister Schäuble says there is no need to change the fiscal rules for Europe, but Italian ministers are on the record for saying perhaps we could allow more expansive policy within the Eurozone as a whole, rather than this very focused spotlight on specific country deficits. Do you think there's some value in us going down that path if Germany was prepared to go down that path as well?
My view is that we have to give practical content to a term we often use, which is growth-friendly fiscal consolidation. That, to me, has two dimensions. One is the profile that has to be exploited in full given the fiscal space. The other one, which is often underestimated, is changing the composition of fiscal adjustment, both on the spending and the taxation side. We can use the same amount of resources improving growth prospects and labor content of growth.
And Larry Summers, let me bring you in on that, because I think that plays into one of the big messages that you've been trying to send, and which the IMF also now seems to be on the same table with, which is that for public investment, maybe we need to adjust the rule set slightly. If we can show the value of borrowing to invest in public infrastructure with an economic benefit, it is something that should be done in Europe.
Yes, 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 yes. Look, what's happening in Europe is not working. Look at a graph of European GDP relative to what Europeans forecast 6 years ago. Look at a graph of Japanese GDP in the mid-90s, 1997, relative to what was forecast in 1990. It is the same story. Output between 10 and 15% below what was forecast. Deflation setting in. Policymakers taking satisfaction in the fact that financial emergency has been avoided. Firm speeches being given about the desirability of structural reform. What followed in Japan was what, relative to any expectation that the Japanese had at the time, was another 15 years of deflation and dismal economic performance, presaged by dramatic declines in interest rates. That is, I believe, the path that Europe is on without a substantial discontinuity in policy. A substantial discontinuity in policy does not mean living for the present rather than for the future. If a company borrows money, it burdens its future. If a company defers maintenance on all of its factories, it burdens its future. If a company fails to fund its pension obligation, it burdens its future. If a company fails to invest in renewal of its products, it fails its future. These are all deficits. And the monolithic focus on the financial deficit to the exclusion of the investment deficit, which causes a growth deficit, has been a very substantial error in Europe. The IMF, this is not a bunch of loose, ludicrous, goofy Keynesians teaching in the Ivy League. This is the IMF. They are the people who wrote the sentence, properly managed infrastructure investments pay for themselves in the form of lower debt burdens. It was the International Monetary Fund that, in its current World Economic Outlook, reports that a 1% increase in GDP devoted to infrastructure will, after 5 years, lead to a 7% of GDP lower debt to GDP ratio.
Larry?
And the trend is continuing.
Let me interrupt.
It is the right thing to do.
It's not easy to get in, I know, but let me just stop you for a moment. Because you understand the challenge for Minister Schäuble. He comes from a country that is concerned about debt financing, the spendthrift behavior of other economies around Europe. It's targeting a zero budget for 2015. It believes that you should only spend what you earn. Mr. Schäuble has to convince, or maybe he doesn't actually, his fellow Germans that being more flexible with these rules or investing more heavily by borrowing into public investment in Europe is the right way to try and kickstart European growth. How does he go about doing that? I have enough problems with American politics without trying to recommend political strategy in Germany. I would suggest that if Mr. Schäuble convinced himself, I suspect he could convince the rest of Germany. And I think an important, I think an important part of the problem is that I suspect that the German executive director did not hugely welcome the IMF report that I was praising so fulsomely. But look, in all seriousness, Mr. Schäuble is right that there has been very substantial waste and profligacy. He is right that if you do not properly monitor expenditures, you create entitlements that become uncontrolled. And so what we need is proper Germanic discipline applied to growth strategy rather than simply applied to more satisfactory accounting. Just one last point, if you'll permit me. How do you tell in elementary economics whether at root you have a supply problem or at root you have a demand problem? It's pretty simple. When you have more demand than supply, prices and inflation accelerate. When you have more supply than demand, prices and inflation decelerate. It's deceleration that happens in Europe, that is happening in Europe, and that's why Europe has to reckon with the fact that while at most times and places German economics is right, at
the very extraordinary condition of zero interest rates and deflation, that's when demand economics comes into play. And that's a crucial aspect of our current situation. And the quicker we recognize that, the sooner we will deal with it, and we will get back to normal, where the right focus can be traditionally healthy finance.
Minister, let me give you the right to reply. Larry Summers has said an awful lot about you and Germany. Here's your opportunity, perhaps, to respond to him.
Look, I think generally he is right. It is the problem is to solve the given problem today without falling back to the mistakes that created the crisis in the last couple of years. Therefore, that makes Europe a little bit complicated. Therefore, by the way, you can't compare Europe neither with Japan nor with the United States of America, to be very frank. And if I look, and always look very carefully to all reports of the IMF, and I look to all recommendations on German economy, because I am thankful for any advice by well-experienced economic experts and so on. That's not, I'm not the best economists all over the world, by far not. But I have to look on the given situation in Europe as well. And as you, for example, I will tell you why did I start as I do in this discussion. If we start to make bashing one another in Europe, we will be lost. We have to work together. We achieved in the last couple of years in the IMF and in the G20 framework to act as Europeans together and not to make European difficulties. I wouldn't be pleased on discussion whether there are discussions between North and South Dakota in the IMF framework. That's up to do it in America, by the way. We do our European problems in Europe, and we do it. You can believe. And then we have to act together. If Germany starts to tell Italy what Italy should do, we will be seen as arrogant, and we have absolutely no reason to be seen as arrogant on behalf of European destiny and history and blah, 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 blah. We know all. It's very difficult. Having said this, you have to know the specificities of Europe, if you have to have in mind. We Europeans, the average figure, our expenditure for social purposes in relation to GDP is double compared to the United States, Canada, Australia, other well-advanced economies. Having that in mind, Europe is very specific, and you have to make all these right things Larry Summers are telling, how they will work if they will be implemented in Europe. And that is what makes things different. Therefore, we all agreed under the presidency of Piercarlo Padoan that in Europe we have to move, and even in Germany, and therefore the finance minister is feels very well supported, and if anyone asks us to spend more money for investment, private investment, public investment, infrastructure and so on. If you take money in Europe to say 500 billion for investment, that is not done. Therefore, we have agreed and we have decided to ask Commission, European Investment Bank, to make a list of opportunities for investment, public investment, until December. And then I bet we will finance any opportunity for real investment which they will define.
How will that be? How will those projects be financed? How do you envisage that happening?
As soon as we have the list, we will care on this. And I do the same in Germany. But before we have the list, I will not. Because I bet the reaction would be that we only rely on how we can finance, and we don't care how it will be implemented. And that is what we have to change in Europe. That's what we are working for.
The German economy. Can you make it very quickly?
I'd make it very quickly. I was interested in the analogy of focusing within Europe versus within the United States. it's not a perfect analogy. I cannot imagine that if South Dakota found itself unable to service its debts, that the rest of the United States would turn to the International Monetary Fund for hundreds of billions of dollars. And that is what has happened within Europe. And that does create a somewhat different dynamic in terms of the expectation of involvement and the ability to consolidate positions. And I'm sure when Europe was prepared to entirely respect a principle of regional responsibility with respect to bailing out those who had trouble in Europe, that the rest of the world would come to a rather greater appreciation of the virtue of consolidated European positions.
Short reaction. First of all, we are thankful for the assistance of global economy, of IMF, that is done. And in the last couple of years in overcoming the euro crisis, which, by the way, I repeat by myself, was not caused in Europe. The very reason was in America, to be very frank. But we were under huge pressure from the global economy, communication, to make the European currency more trustful and to avoid this underlying risk. Therefore, we did it. Now we start. Yesterday, German Parliament decided to agree that the IMF lending for Ireland will be paid back in advance. Because so we are reducing, we are on the way to remain thankful for all the assistance we got, but not to rely on this assistance for the future. But of course, Europe must not rely on the assistance of the rest of the world. That is not the way we want to make Europe stable and for future. It's quite clear. But it's a proof. Yesterday we agreed that Ireland, number 2 under the program countries, will pay back in advance the IMF lending.
It's very encouraging to hear you talking about new public spending programs and investment, because clearly there is growth attached to those projects. But let me ask you, while we are on this topic, why the implacable resistance to allowing the European Central Bank to expand its balance sheet through sovereign debt purchasing? Is it any surprise that it's the UK and the US that come out ranking highest in the growth studies from the IMF when these two banks very aggressively pursued QE to expand their balance sheets and get their economies back on the road? And yet this is the one thing that Europe has failed to do so far to match its Anglo-Saxon cousins.
If Mario Draghi would be at this table, I think he would agree with all Piercarlo and myself have said. Therefore, be a little bit reluctant, because he is saying again and again and again what Europe has to do, European governments, is to stick on structural reforms, implementation, and stick to the rules of the Pact on Stability and Growth. Having said this, once again, the difference between the US, for example, and Europe in this regard is we have one monetary policy and 18 different national fiscal and economic policy. Having said this creates a huge moral hazard problem. And this have to have in mind. Therefore, the European Central Bank is totally independent. Therefore, a German finance minister does never criticize or commend European Central Banks to having said this. It's up to the European Central Bank. But with monetary policy, that is, I quote Mario Draghi, even in his speech in Jackson Hole, with monetary policy you can't solve the problems. You have to solve it with the decisions by national governments, because we have no fiscal and economic union. By the way, German government, the Federal Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, is always asking for an amendment to the European treaties to enhance the governance of the Eurozone. And it's difficult to get, because some, not Italy, Italy would be always in favor of amendments to the treaty, but some other member states of Europe are totally reluctant in any amendment to European treaties. That is a given situation in Europe. And on this basis, you have to tackle the problems, because you have to, political responsibility as a government is always a rendezvous with the reality.
So what I hear you say is actually the quid pro quo for further monetary stimulus is harmonization of fiscal policy across Europe on German terms?
No, it's not harmonizing on German terms. By the way, the idea that the achieved integration economically in European integration in the late 80s strongly requires a currency union was not a German idea. It was the idea of Jacques Delors before German reunification, by the way. It was the famous and very famous Jacques Delors who asked for a monetary union. And the discussion was, can we achieve a monetary union without a political union? If we would have said, no, we need at first a political union, we wouldn't have ever get it, because even for the United States, it would be difficult to shift national sovereignty to an international organization. In Europe, we are doing, but it's difficult in this way, and therefore we started with a monetary union on the pact on stability and growth. And now the problem, what happened was that France and Germany did not respect these rules. And if you have to rely on such a pact, you have to stick to the rules, otherwise you fail. And now today we are asked again and again, we will not see again that the rules are implemented for smaller member states, but not for the bigger member states. We have the same right for all of our member states. Equal treating is a precondition for European integration. That's Europe. Difficult for American economists, by the way. I'm sorry for that.
Just one final question to both ministers, if I could, and then I'd like to move on because we've got so much more ground that I'd love us to cover. But you talked about this public investment program that you're now working on. This seems very early stage, but it's very interesting, and perhaps it fits in with the Commission President's own comments about a 300 billion euro fund that might roll forward. But if France gets downgraded and we see little evidence of French attempts to adjust their own fiscal path, will that be a deal breaker when it comes to any large fund that might be used for public infrastructure or investment projects across the Eurozone?
The problem is, once again, I have to repeat myself, we have agreed that we will stick on concrete investments, that we will make, and we have asked the European Commission, by the way, Jean-Claude Juncker, I am totally supportive on his 300 billion program. I did it from the very beginning, from the first day when he made it publicly, I supported it publicly. He's not in office until now. He has to be, he needs a vote in the European Parliament for the Commission as a whole, and then he will take office on the 1st of November. And then he will ask for 3 months to make concrete what is his program. That is the way Europe works. Europe is sometimes a little bit slow and difficult, but we, in the long term, we are successful. We achieve what we promised. In the Euro crisis, again and again, against all doubts, we achieved what we promised. You never believed, and we did it. And the IMF did not believe we did it. We delivered. We overcome the fundamental lack of confidence in the stability of the European currency. We delivered. By step. And so we will do the same. And now we are looking for, and we have decided in December we will look on that. And I bid and I promise we will find financing for any concrete investment we have. The problem is, if you look at European funds and you look at the rates which funds are used, regional funds, structural funds by member states, I will not quote the rates of some member states. But you can see that even some administrations are not able to deliver the preconditions to use European funds. Therefore, to increase the funds does not solve the problem.
Minister Padoan, I wonder if you care to comment on this.
Well, very quickly, to have investment going, you need at least 2 conditions. First of all, you need to have good projects, profitable projects. And this is part of the story, because when we're talking about investment in Europe, we don't have in mind only public investment. We have in mind the fact that private investment needs to revert its declining course. So you need good projects, and then you need financing. Financing can come from the budget, public budget in some cases, but in most cases, it should come from the market. So you need to put in place measures to simplify, to facilitate, to spread the range of financing mechanisms so that investment, both private and public, gets financed. And this is, by the way, what we're beginning to do at the national level in my country.
David Lipton, can I bring you in? Do you hear anything across this end of your long table that sounds like an agenda for growth or a program for growth that is different from what we've heard in the last 6 years?
Well, I find this very entertaining, and I will try not to distract from this great debate that's been going on. But let me try to put this in a slightly broader perspective, that the way we view Europe. We've spoken at these meetings about this week about the new mediocre setting in. I think we mean two things by that, that while we are projecting some recovery next year, both for the globe and for Europe, we think that Europe could do better, and we worry that it may do worse. And that in particular, the kind of low inflation, low growth scenario that is possible could set in. We share the view that the ECB has tried to do a lot, and it should keep actually trying to do whatever it takes, but we share the view that Mario Draghi, I think, raised when he was in Jackson Hole, and the minister referred to, that it may be that to ensure success, the ECB needs support from other policies around Europe in order to be able to attain their inflation goal, to, in doing so, to help Europe deal with the heavy indebtedness of households and companies and the needs for banks to restore health. So we've focused on trying to progress with supportive policies on every dimension: aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and rebalancing. It's the same thing we've said for the global economy. Now, on the aggregate demand side, we think that there is some scope for more fiscal support in countries that have completed consolidation. We think that countries that need to consolidate should be careful to be as growth supportive as possible, although that is a more difficult task. We believe that the structural reforms that Minister Schäuble has talked about are also important in raising potential growth, so that, because Europe's potential growth prospects themselves are not so great. The key discussion that Larry has pointed to about investment, we've taken up in our most recent writings. Investment in infrastructure is both a demand-supportive policy, especially where there's slack, and in some European countries there's a lot of slack, and it's one that will raise productivity in countries, and so we think that wherever that can be explored, it should be. Now, even in a country like Germany, where there isn't slack, there is a current account surplus of about 8% of GDP, which means that output is 8% higher than spending. And so there, where if there can be some greater infrastructure spending, if that raises expenditure, as long as other policies are adjusted, Germany can do better itself, but also make a contribution globally through rebalancing. So we're looking at how we believe countries' policies and European policies can be supportive in all of these ways. Let me just end with one thing that, many people in Europe say that any demand support will lessen the incentive for doing the hard and politically difficult structural reforms. Our view is that that in essence is inviting an approach where you make things so bad that a country has to take structural reform measures. I think clearly what's first best is to operate on all fronts, trying to be supportive of demand to close the slack and carry out the structural reforms. I would warrant that it can be done. There are countries that are not doing what they should. In the program countries where the IMF's been involved, there have been quite remarkable structural adjustment measures taken. So clearly it can be done if the politics are right. And of course, our job at the IMF is to try to advocate for the first best. I honestly don't believe that if you focus only on structural policies and don't attend to the problem of the slack in the economy, the unemployment rates, which are high in some countries, it's very doubtful that structural policies alone can do the trick. That's why we see infrastructure investment, which really operates on both sides, as offering some promise.
Just very quickly, I just want to come back to you, because the hard money advocates in the room, the Austrians amongst us, would say, you know, look at the Geneva report. Global debt has only increased. Debt to GDP globally is in excess of 200% here. There was no great deleveraging, if you like. Have we not reached a point where it's now excessive debt in the global economy that is constraining both demand, keeping interest rates, inflation, and growth low at this point? And if that is true, then what you're advocating with this epiphany at the IMF now about investment spend won't work.
I mean, it is the debt is a legacy of the pre-crisis period and the way the crisis unfolded and was dealt with. It is one of the great conundrums of macroeconomics that sometimes when there's debt and it causes a lot of unemployment and slack, that the answer is actually more debt. And as Larry was referring to, in our paper, we show that in a country with a lot of slack, and it's not true everywhere, but in a country with a lot of slack, if you put people back to work and undertake investment projects that have a rate of return, you raise GDP by enough that the burden of debt, since the issue isn't how many euros of debt you have, the issue is the burden of debt. The burden of debt is not likely to increase. In fact, it's more likely to decrease because of the growth impact. And our study shows the growth impact may be substantial and be long-lived.
Okay, I think a few people want to respond to this. Minister Schäuble, did you want to come in? You looked at me with a knowing look and almost a wink.
No, I just wanted to come back to the remark of David to the member states of European monetary union which have been under program. That is exactly the problem we suffer in Europe. In the member states under program, we get they needed assistance. We had conditionality. By the way, in the Troika, we had IMF, thanks to IMF, ECB and European Commission. So IMF was always the most not liked member of this in asking for a deficit reduction and structural reforms, because he was not as close to the decision taking, and therefore he was a little bit more stringent. And by the assistance of the IMF, we achieved that in the OECD report, which member state of the OECD has been successfully implementing structural reforms. The 5 leading member states are the 5 member states under program. And with the IMF assistance, we did exactly the right thing. And now you ask us for Europe, for the rest of Europe, to do things which are the opposite, which we achieved in the program countries. And that is a little bit not, that is what I have just said. To take responsibility as a government, it's always a rendezvous with the reality, and that it makes things much more difficult. We have this problem in the given structure of Europe, that implementation is the most critical thing. In the program member states, we had not the problem in implementation, we had instruments to implementation. Therefore, we need, and German government is strongly working in favor of enhancing the governance of the Eurozone. Then we can have a lot of more instruments to solve the problems.
So I just want to be very clear about this. What you're saying is you reject the IMF's new remedy for getting growth back because it doesn't work for Europe.
No,
so that's what it sounded like to me.
Sometimes I think the recommendations of the IMF seems to be a little bit controversial, because they are the opposite what we did together in the Troika in relation to program countries. And therefore, I remind even the expert of the IMF that the reality is sometimes a little bit more complex than the theory in some teaching books.
I think you have to decide.
Go on, very quickly.
I think you have to decide whether you think it's working or whether you think it's not. If you think it's all working, then you should continue with the strategy that's been in place for the last few years. if you think that it's working only in the very limited sense that you preserved the euro as a common area and you prevented major financial institutions from failing, but virtually every year, growth has been far short of what was expected, and you've been surprised every year by the weakness of growth and by the extent of deflationary forces, then you think, as I believe, that you need a discontinuity in strategy. And in particular, you need to recognize this, which was a central principle for the United States, which was a central principle for FDR, because make no mistake, we are dealing with something that approaches the Depression. It is the central irony of financial crisis that while it is caused by too much borrowing, too much lending, and too much spending, it is only resolved with more confidence, more lending, more borrowing, and more spending. On structural reform, take the canonical structural reform. Rules that say you can't fire people, which means you never hire people, because who would check into a hotel? Who would check into a hotel which they might not be able to check out of? It's right. People are right. That's a huge problem. Now, in what kind of environment are you likely to be more successful in peeling away excessive job security rules? An environment where you say structural reform is our priority, growth will come in years, or an environment where you're doing a whole set of things to create alternative jobs, and so reducing job security is less burdensome because the people can find other jobs. The point is that strengthening demand and avoiding deflation makes structural reform easier. I know of many successful cases where structural reform accompanied dealing with excessive inflation. I know of no case in which deflation was a powerful spur to structural reform.
Let's move on, because we've talked a lot about what Europe can do to help itself. I just want to deal with what challenges Europe is going to face from the external environment. I had a great conversation with Axel Weber yesterday, and he talked about the misdiagnosis of some of Germany's current growth problems. And he pointed to Russia, he pointed to Ukraine, he pointed to some nervousness in the investment environment. Ian, this is a good place to bring you in, because you're a political scientist and you can help us understand how much more challenging the next 6 to 12 months is going to be, with a number of geopolitical issues running parallel. ISIL, Ukraine, Ebola. What is this going to mean as Europe tries to heal itself?
I mean, yeah, I am the political scientist on the panel, and I'm not sure it needs to be central to what we're talking about, but you could be forgiven for believing, from listening to both of our European ministers, that the external political environment was relatively stable, and be forgiven for believing that the domestic political environment within these European states was reasonably unchanged. Not necessarily favorable, but at least wasn't becoming more problematic, because if it was, and if it was urgent, then certainly you'd say, well, given that, we might need to be more urgent in our response. I think political science is relevant here, and both of these things are becoming much more challenging. And we hear about them in headlines here in the United States, but let's be very clear. Whether you talk about Russia, Ukraine, or whether you talk about the likelihood of an Iranian deal not working and energy coming off the markets, which does look to be the case at this point, whether you look about the growing war in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey's border now, and the spillover of radicalism, whether you talk about Ebola and where those people that are infected or believed to be infected end up traveling, on every single one of those issues, the Europeans are massively more vulnerable than the Americans are or the Japanese are. and none of them seem to have quick fixes, and so that would imply that there needs to be a level of greater urgency. And I mean, in fact, on the Russia-Ukraine issue, which is the one that I'm personally most concerned about in terms of the proximate risk to the Europeans, you actually have the German government taking a leadership role in driving further sanctions, which can be perfectly understandable from an international security perspective, but has nothing to do with the conversation we've just had over the last 30 minutes. And indeed, many other European governments saying, wait a second, this is causing massive pain, we can't afford it. Really, the same government that wants austerity is going to whack the Russians and is going to hurt and make our economies more vulnerable. At the same time, you have a bottom-up environment that's also problematic politically. It's problematic in Spain, where the economy's turning around and you have some growth. I don't know if I'd quite call it the new mediocre, but it's the new not quite emergency. You also have a new populist left-wing party that did reasonably well for just being created 6 months ago in European parliamentary elections, now is polling at 15%. In Greece, also moving towards positive growth after depression. Syriza is now actually the most popular party in the country, and they have elections coming up. You look at the National Front in France. You look even at Germany, and you look at alternatives for Germany now taking 3 states in recent regional elections, and over 10% in 2, almost 10% in the 3rd, with an anti-EU platform. All of those things are going to make the decisions that are being made here, in my view, considerably more challenging for a Eurozone that is clearly far less robust in its ability to demonstrate resilience to it than, say, the United States would be. That's why I think you need at least a little political science on this panel today.
Feel free, please.
No, I don't mind, really.
Minister Schäuble, can I ask you to respond to some of those? I mean, from where we sit in Europe, we look at the situation in Russia, and it does appear that we have de-escalated to a certain extent. A ceasefire is in place in Ukraine, albeit with some breaches. The second round of sanctions have been imposed. They're being digested by the Russians. We now have talk of some legislation that tit-for-tat style may involve seizure of foreign company assets in Russia at this stage. That would not be a good thing, would it? That might take us back up the ladder of escalation, it seems.
Let's hope that you are right. But I don't know. Therefore, we have to remain with. Therefore, we all are saying, as President Obama has said in his speech in the United Nations, we don't want escalation. We can withdraw as soon as Russia competes. We have said there will be no military solution for Ukraine. That is impossible. That means that we will not accept the violation of international law. We cannot accept the violation of the right of any nation to decide its destiny itself, independent. And therefore, if there is no military solution, we have to do it by political and by economic instruments, and that, of course, will cause damage. By far, the most damage is to the German economy, to be very clear. We know it in advance, but we have to take the price. It's quite clear. Yeah, of course. What is the alternative? And therefore, that have to have in mind, and that is what we also have to deliver in Europe as well. And that is what I just mentioned. And by the way, what you have said is totally convincing, except one argument. At least in Europe, I don't know whether it's in America. The readiness to make changes is higher if population feels some pressure, some need. We have always seen that we can move for progress in European integration. For example, to shift some parts of national sovereignty to European institutions, only in times of crisis. As soon as you have some success, the risk of complacency is much higher, and that is also something we have to deliver. Therefore, once again, what we know in Europe is that as well as since we have decided, all Europeans, that we will not go once again to military solutions. What, by the way, means urgently that no one has any doubt that the NATO is, and the Article 5 of NATO is working. And is, yeah, of course, it's a precondition for the existence of my own country. Without the guarantee of Article 5 NATO treaty, I wouldn't sit here. There wouldn't be a united Germany. And we will not forget, there must be no doubt, but beyond this, we must solve the problems by international diplomacy, by political efforts, by unity of all Europeans, by unity of the Western Union, and by economic instruments. That is the only instruments we have, and that may cause some problems, but the major risk in the medium term is to Russia, and therefore I'm quite optimistic we will convince the Russians. We are ready to do it together.
We have a minute 30 left on the program. Make the point
I'll be very
quickly.
quick, which is just that I do wonder to what extent. I agree that complacency sets in, and that's why you don't move. You need crisis to deal with issues of sovereignty. I would submit that much of what we're seeing geopolitically should be moving the Europeans to more of a sense of crisis than they're presently feeling. I would also suggest that as important as NATO has been historically, it is viewed as considerably less important by many of the NATO allies today in Europe, hence the lack of budgetary concerns and willingness to actually pay. The divisions we're seeing within Europe, I think they're greater with the Russia-Ukraine crisis than they were before, and I think the divisions between the United States and a Germany-led Europe after not just NATO and Ukraine, but things like NSA, are much greater than they were before, and that's going to complicate the resolutions of these issues.
Yes, but thanks to the crisis, all these problems will be reduced to the real dimension, and they have been over-exaggerated in the last couple of months and years, by the way. The risk for Europe and the risk for Germany is not from the United States. The only risk is that we would lose the linkage with the United States.
From your mouth to God's ears, I'm with you.
Which is a point, I think, where we should wrap up the televisual part of the conversation we've been having. Gentlemen, it's been very engaging. Hopefully, we've managed to take a few steps forward on the key question, which was a reform agenda for Europe and how we might get growth back into continental Europe. It's been a pleasure having you all with us at this event. And ladies and gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure having you here as well. Thanks so much for joining us and being with us. Louisa, let me send it back to you now in London.
Well, Jeff Cutmore there hosting that debate. We've been listening, and you've been watching CNBC's special debate taking place. So we'll have some reaction on that in just a couple of minutes. Let me just